Más fuerza, rápido.
¡Venga, venga, venga!
20 reales.
Asante.
The English will attack here by dawn. We must be ready.
We can flank them through the swamps, here.
That cuts off their retreat. We are agreed.
Bring the cannon to bear. Make haste.
¡Apunten y fuego! ¡Recarguen! Adiós, Saint Augustine. Dejamos atrás nuestra vida aquí.
Es una lástima que los ingleses lo tomen todo.
Stop everything, because what I'm about to reveal will completely shatter everything you think you know about American colonial history. Picture this. It's 1670. While English colonists in Virginia and Massachusetts are still figuring out how to survive in America, there's a city in Florida that's already been thriving for over a century. A city more sophisticated than Boston, more multicultural than New York, more militarily advanced than any English settlement in North America. St. Augustine, Florida, America's oldest European city, founded in 1565, 42 years before Jamestown even existed. But here's what's going to blow your mind. This isn't just an older city. This is a completely different model of American colonization. While English colonies are built on religious conformity, economic exploitation, and racial segregation, St. Augustine represents something revolutionary, a truly multicultural society where Spanish conquistadors, African freedmen, Native American allies, and mixed-race citizens create the most integrated community in colonial America. But there's something else about St. Augustine that makes this story absolutely crucial. By 1670, this Spanish paradise is under siege. English colonial expansion is threatening to destroy the most successful multicultural experiment in American history. And the battle for St. Augustine isn't just about territory. It's about two completely different visions of what America could become. The English vision, religious uniformity, racial hierarchy, economic exploitation. The Spanish vision, Catholic conversion, racial mixing, military honor. One of these visions will survive, the other will be destroyed forever. And the outcome will determine what kind of society America becomes for the next 300 years. This is the story of America's first culture war. Catholic Spain versus Protestant England. Multicultural integration versus racial segregation. Military honor versus commercial profit. But here's the most shocking part. The Spanish model was winning, until English numbers became so overwhelming that survival became impossible. What you're about to witness is the death of the America that might have been, and the birth of the America that actually was. The impossible beginning. Let me take you back to the miracle that created St. Augustine. September 8, 1565. Don Pedro Menendez de Aviles lands in Florida with a mission that seems impossible: establish a permanent Spanish colony in the most hostile environment in North America. Picture what Menendez faces. Florida is controlled by powerful Native American confederations who have already destroyed multiple European attempts at colonization. The climate is brutal: hurricanes, diseases, swamps that kill Europeans faster than any battlefield. Most importantly, French Protestant colonists have already established Fort Caroline just north of where St. Augustine will be built. They're allied with local tribes and determined to prevent Spanish Catholic expansion. But Menendez has something no previous European colonizer possessed: a completely different approach to American settlement. Instead of trying to conquer and exploit Native Americans, Menendez proposes alliance and conversion. Instead of establishing racial hierarchy, he encourages intermarriage between Spanish colonists and native women. Instead of pursuing economic extraction, he prioritizes military security and religious missions. Within months, Menendez achieves something no English colonist will accomplish for decades: genuine cooperation with Native American leaders based on mutual military benefit. Here's how it works. Spanish military technology helps Native allies defeat their traditional enemies. Native knowledge of Florida environment helps Spanish colonists survive climate and geography that kills other Europeans. But the alliance goes deeper than military cooperation. Spanish colonial policy actually encourages racial mixing through legal marriage between Spanish men and native women. Their children, minus called mestizos, become full Spanish citizens with inheritance rights and social mobility. By 1570, St. Augustine isn't just surviving, it's creating something unprecedented, a genuinely integrated society where racial mixing is legal policy rather than forbidden practice. Compare this to English colonial practice. Racial separation is legally enforced. Intermarriage is prohibited. Native Americans are treated as permanent enemies to be removed rather than potential citizens to be converted. St. Augustine proves that European colonization of America doesn't have to mean genocide, exploitation, and racial hierarchy. Spanish colonial methods create prosperity through integration rather than separation. The multicultural miracle. By 1600, St. Augustine has become something that doesn't exist anywhere else in colonial America, a functioning multicultural society with legal equality between different racial groups. Picture walking through St. Augustine's streets in 1620. Spanish conquistadors in military dress conducting business with Timucua chiefs in traditional regalia. African freedmen who earned citizenship through military service operating successful businesses. Mestizo families whose Spanish fathers and native mothers have created children who speak multiple languages and navigate multiple cultures. This isn't just tolerance. This is legal integration backed by Spanish colonial policy. Here's what makes St. Augustine truly revolutionary. Spanish law recognizes multiple paths to citizenship. Military service grants full rights regardless of race. Catholic conversion provides legal equality regardless of origin. Successful business ownership creates social mobility regardless of ancestry. The result is a society where a freed African slave can become a prosperous merchant. A Native American chief can hold Spanish military rank, and a mestizo child can inherit property from both Spanish and native grandparents. But St. Augustine's success creates something even more remarkable: cultural innovation through racial mixing. Architecture that combines Spanish colonial techniques with Native American environmental adaptation. Cuisine that blends Spanish ingredients with native Florida foods and African cooking methods. Music that fuses Spanish religious traditions with native ceremonial practices. By 1650, St. Augustine culture isn't Spanish, native, or African. It's genuinely American, in ways that English colonies never achieve. And there's something else that makes St. Augustine unique. Military equality creates social equality. Spanish colonial defense depends on integrated military units, where Spanish soldiers, native warriors, African freedmen, and mestizo citizens fight together against common enemies. Shared military risk creates shared political rights. When you fight together to defend the same community, racial hierarchy becomes militarily impossible. Unity in combat requires equality in citizenship. The fortress city. But St. Augustine's multicultural paradise exists under constant military threat. By 1650, English colonial expansion is creating pressure that will test whether integration can survive systematic attack. Picture St. Augustine's response. The construction of Castillo de San Marcos, the most sophisticated military fortress in colonial America. This isn't just a defensive structure. It's a statement of Spanish determination to preserve their multicultural experiment against English colonial aggression. The Castillo demonstrates Spanish military engineering at its most advanced. Stone walls that can withstand English artillery, sophisticated defensive positions that control St. Augustine's harbor, supply storage that can sustain siege warfare for months. But here's what makes the Castillo truly remarkable. It's built by the same integrated workforce that makes St. Augustine society possible. Spanish military engineers design the fortifications. Native American workers provide environmental knowledge about local materials and construction techniques. African craftsmen contribute masonry skills learned in Caribbean fortress construction. Mestizo supervisors coordinate between different cultural groups. The fortress that protects St. Augustine's multicultural society is itself a product of multicultural cooperation. By 1670, the Castillo is complete, and St. Augustine has become the most militarily sophisticated city in colonial America. More advanced than anything in English colonial settlements, more impregnable than any other fortress in North America. But military sophistication can't solve St. Augustine's fundamental problem: demographics. While St. Augustine's population grows through integration and natural increase, English colonial population explodes through massive immigration. By 1670, there are roughly 2,000 people in St. Augustine and nearly 100,000 in English colonies. Spanish Florida faces the same challenge that Native Americans everywhere will face. Superior military technology and social organization can't overcome overwhelming numerical disadvantage. The English pressure. By 1670, English colonial expansion has reached the point where St. Augustine's survival requires constant military vigilance against systematic destruction campaigns. Here's what English colonial leaders understand. St. Augustine represents an existential threat to English colonial society, not military threat. Spanish Florida doesn't have enough people to threaten English settlements militarily, but ideological threat. St. Augustine proves that European colonization can succeed through racial integration rather than racial hierarchy, that multicultural societies can be more militarily effective than racially segregated societies. If the Spanish model spreads, it undermines the English justification for enslaving Africans, removing Native Americans, and maintaining racial hierarchy as the foundation of colonial prosperity. So English colonial policy toward Spanish Florida isn't just territorial expansion, it's cultural warfare designed to destroy the alternative model of American colonization. The attacks begin in earnest during the 1670s. English-sponsored raids from Carolina target Spanish missions, destroying churches and killing priests. English privateers attack Spanish supply ships, cutting St. Augustine's connections to Caribbean support. Most dangerously, English colonists begin offering freedom to enslaved Africans who escape from English plantations to Spanish Florida, then using those escapes as justification for military campaigns against St. Augustine. Picture the irony. English colonists enslave Africans, then attack Spanish Florida for giving those Africans freedom and citizenship. But here's what makes English attacks truly devastating. They target St. Augustine's greatest strength, its multicultural integration. English raids specifically target mixed-race settlements, destroying communities where Spanish, Native, and African populations have created successful integration. English propaganda emphasizes racial mixing as evidence of Spanish moral corruption. The message is clear: racial integration is unnatural, dangerous, and must be destroyed to protect proper racial hierarchy. By 1680, St. Augustine is under siege, not just militarily, but culturally. English pressure is forcing Spanish Florida to choose between survival and principles. The cultural siege. By 1680, the siege of St. Augustine has become something more complex than military warfare, a systematic campaign to destroy multicultural society by making integration economically and militarily impossible. Here's how English cultural warfare works. Economic blockade cuts St. Augustine off from Caribbean trade networks that fund multicultural society. Military pressure forces Spanish resources into defensive preparations rather than cultural development. Most importantly, propaganda warfare portrays St. Augustine's racial integration as evidence of Spanish weakness and moral corruption. English colonial writers describe racial mixing as unnatural, Spanish tolerance as weakness, and multicultural cooperation as evidence that Spanish colonists have gone native and abandoned European civilization. Picture the psychological pressure. Spanish colonists, who have spent generations building integrated communities, are now told that integration itself proves their failure as Europeans. Some Spanish families begin questioning whether multicultural society is worth the constant military threat. whether racial integration justifies permanent siege warfare against overwhelming English numbers. But here's what makes St. Augustine's response remarkable. Instead of abandoning integration, the community doubles down on multicultural unity as their only hope for survival. Spanish military leaders realize that their numerical disadvantage makes European-style racial hierarchy impossible. They need every possible ally, Spanish, native, African, and mixed race, fighting together to have any chance against English expansion. The result is even greater integration. African freedmen receive military commissions. Native leaders hold Spanish colonial offices. Mestizo citizens serve as diplomatic representatives to other native tribes. St. Augustine's siege creates the most racially integrated leadership in colonial American history, not despite military pressure, but because of it. The final resistance, 1702. Queen Anne's War brings English colonial aggression against St. Augustine to a climax. Governor James Moore of Carolina launches a full-scale invasion designed to destroy Spanish Florida permanently. Picture the odds. Moore attacks with 500 English colonists plus 300 Native American allies. St. Augustine's total population is barely 1,500, including women, children, and elderly civilians. But St. Augustine's integrated defense demonstrates something extraordinary. Multicultural military cooperation creates fighting effectiveness that exceeds the sum of its parts. Spanish military leadership provides professional tactical knowledge. Native warriors contribute environmental expertise and guerrilla warfare techniques. African soldiers bring Caribbean military experience and cultural knowledge of tropical warfare. Most importantly, mixed-race citizens serve as communication bridges between different cultural groups, enabling coordination that pure racial hierarchy could never achieve. The siege lasts 2 months. English forces surround the city and bombard the Castillo with artillery, expecting quick surrender from an outnumbered multicultural garrison. Instead, they encounter resistance that shocks English military commanders, coordinated defense that adapts European military tactics to American environmental conditions using multicultural knowledge and integrated command structures. When English artillery proves ineffective against the Castillo's stone walls, Moore attempts to starve the garrison into surrender by cutting off supplies. But St. Augustine's multicultural networks provide alternatives. Native allies supply food through secret routes. African citizens use Caribbean trading connections to smuggle in necessary materials. Spanish naval forces run English blockades to deliver military supplies. After 2 months of siege, Moore realizes something that changes English colonial strategy permanently. St. Augustine cannot be conquered by conventional military means because multicultural cooperation creates defensive advantages that racial hierarchy cannot match. The Pyrrhic victory. Moore withdraws from St. Augustine in military failure, but the siege achieves English strategic objectives through economic and cultural destruction. Here's what the siege costs. St. Augustine. Nearly every building outside the Castillo is destroyed. Economic infrastructure built over 140 years is reduced to rubble. The multicultural communities that made Spanish Florida unique are scattered or dead. Most devastatingly, Spanish colonial government lacks resources to rebuild what English attacks destroyed. Picture St. Augustine in 1703. The Castillo still stands as proof that Spanish military engineering can resist English attack. But the city that the fortress protected has been largely destroyed. The multicultural society that created St. Augustine's uniqueness survives in the people who defended it, but the economic foundation that supported integration has been eliminated. Spanish colonial authorities face an impossible choice: invest enormous resources in rebuilding St. Augustine's multicultural experiment, or accept that English numerical superiority makes Spanish Florida unsustainable. The decision reveals the fundamental difference between Spanish and English colonial models. English colonies generate enough economic prosperity to sustain military expansion. Spanish colonies create cultural innovations but lack economic resources for sustained defense. By 1710, St. Augustine has become something it was never intended to be, a military garrison defending Spanish territorial claims rather than a thriving multicultural society demonstrating alternative colonization methods. The integration that made St. Augustine special survives among the people who live there, but the prosperity that made integration attractive has been destroyed by English systematic warfare. The slow decline. Between 1710 and 1763, St. Augustine experiences something tragic: the gradual abandonment of multicultural idealism in favor of mere survival. Spanish colonial policy shifts from promoting racial integration to simply maintaining territorial control. Military considerations override cultural development. Survival takes precedence over social innovation. The result is the slow death of America's most successful multicultural experiment, not through dramatic conquest, but through systematic economic strangulation. Picture the cultural changes: fewer marriages between Spanish colonists and native women, because military tension makes such alliances dangerous. Less African immigration, because Spanish Florida can't offer economic opportunities that justify the risks. Most importantly, mixed-race citizens begin emigrating to other Spanish colonies where multicultural society isn't under constant attack from English expansion. By 1740, St. Augustine retains the legal framework of racial integration, but lacks the economic dynamism that made integration attractive. Cultural innovation gives way to cultural preservation. Social experimentation becomes social defensiveness. The city that once demonstrated how racial mixing could create prosperity becomes a fortress city where multicultural cooperation exists primarily for military necessity. But here's what makes St. Augustine's decline truly tragic. English attacks succeed in destroying Spanish multicultural society, just as English colonies begin experiencing the problems that Spanish integration had solved. English racial hierarchy creates slave rebellions, Native American warfare, and cultural divisions that Spanish integration had avoided. English economic exploitation generates wealth, but also social instability that Spanish cooperation had prevented. By 1750, English colonial leaders privately acknowledged that Spanish methods created more stable societies, but English colonial development has proceeded too far to adopt Spanish alternatives. The final transfer, the Treaty of Paris, ends the 7 Years' War and transfers Florida from Spanish to British control. St. Augustine's 1908-year experiment in multicultural colonization officially ends. Picture the moment of transfer. British troops march into the Castillo de San Marcos, while Spanish colonists, native allies, African citizens, and mixed-race families prepare to abandon the city they built together. Most Spanish colonists choose evacuation to Cuba, rather than life under British racial hierarchy. Native American allies retreat to unconquered territories, rather than accept English colonial domination. African freedmen face re-enslavement under British colonial law. The integrated community that created St. Augustine's uniqueness disperses rather than submit to the racial segregation that English colonial law requires. But here's what makes the transfer truly heartbreaking. British colonial authorities recognized that Spanish methods had created a more stable society than English techniques achieved. British reports describe St. Augustine as more peaceful, more prosperous per capita, and more militarily effective than English colonial settlements. They acknowledge that Spanish racial integration created advantages that British racial hierarchy couldn't match. Yet British colonial law prohibits adopting Spanish multicultural policies because English colonial economy depends on racial hierarchy for labor control, land acquisition, and social organization. The model that worked better can't be implemented because the model that worked worse has become too economically entrenched to change. The eternal lesson. Standing in St. Augustine today, you can still see the Castillo de San Marcos, where America's first multicultural society made its last stand. You can walk the streets where Spanish conquistadors, native warriors, African freedmen, and mixed-race citizens created the most integrated community in colonial history. But in 1670, this wasn't historical monument. It was living proof that American colonization could succeed through inclusion rather than exclusion, cooperation rather than conquest, integration rather than segregation. Imagine one final moment. Picture yourself walking through St. Augustine in 1680, during the height of its multicultural achievement. Spanish soldiers and native warriors planned joint military operations. African merchants and mestizo craftsmen conduct business in integrated markets. Mixed-race families attend Catholic services where Spanish, native, and African cultural traditions blend into genuinely American religious innovation. You're witnessing the America that might have been, a society built on racial integration rather than racial hierarchy, a culture created through mixing rather than segregation, an economy based on cooperation rather than exploitation. St. Augustine proves that European colonization of America didn't have to create genocide, slavery, and racial division. Spanish methods demonstrate that multicultural societies can be more prosperous, more stable, and more militarily effective than racially segregated societies. But St. Augustine also teaches the most tragic lesson in American history. Better systems can be destroyed by worse systems if the worst systems have overwhelming numerical and economic advantages. The Spanish model of multicultural integration was superior to English racial hierarchy in almost every measurable way. But English colonial population growth and economic development created military advantages that Spanish social innovations couldn't overcome. St. Augustine's destruction established the pattern that would define American development. Racial hierarchy would prevail, not because it worked better, but because it generated more resources for systematic expansion and conquest. The multicultural experiment that might have created a different America was destroyed by the racial hierarchy that created the America we inherited. Every American generation faces St. Augustine's challenge, whether to build societies based on inclusion or exclusion, cooperation or conquest, integration or segregation, whether to learn from the Spanish model that worked better or continue the English model that prevailed. That's all for our journey through St. Augustine's transformation from multicultural paradise to last stand fortress. If there's another moment when better systems were destroyed by worse systems, another place where racial integration created prosperity before being eliminated by racial hierarchy, another story about the America that might have been, let me know in the comments. Because the real lesson of St. Augustine isn't that multicultural society is impossible in America. It's that multicultural society was once successful in America, and its destruction was a choice rather than inevitability. Spanish Florida's last stand ended. The dream of multicultural America never will.